Hi, thanks for joining us, everyone. I don't know if anybody's planning to turn on their cameras or not. That's certainly your choice. I'm gonna switch to a different view here. So as I think everyone on the Zoom knows, I'm Chris Johnson, the director here at the Waterford Public Library, and this is our culminating session of the Great Decisions program that we've been running in partnership with the Southeast Connecticut World Affairs Council since March. And let me again publicly thank Paul and the rest of the team over at SECWAC for being such good partners to the library. You were instrumental in us getting the grant and obviously in securing our speakers, including this evening's speaker. And again, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in the program. It was a big ask to have folks meet for 4 months, nearly every week, and to actually read a chapter before many of the meetings. So I appreciate everyone's diligence, and I've enjoyed getting to know each and every one of you. And as I mentioned in my email, I'll be reaching out with a survey, and I'll also be reaching out in the fall when we get next year's list of topics. So hopefully we can do this again next year. And I'm going to pass it off to Paul, who will be introducing our speaker this evening.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thank you back to you. Thanks for collaborating with SECWAC. As I told you at the beginning, Great Decisions was something that I wanted to get going a long time, for quite a while. Bandwidth prevented me from doing it, and then you came along and suggested it. So it went very well. I'm looking forward to 2023 and seeing what the topics are in the fall. But as you said, this is our last meeting this evening. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker, a guy who has spoken at SECWAC before, and I watch him almost every Friday if I can. I'm going to give a plug for Peter's the Beinart notebook. It's a Substack. It's a by subscription. Very minimal charge. Peter, you could probably charge more, but he has some fantastic speakers.
I put it in the chat, by the way. Thank you, Paul. I really
put it in the chat. There you go. Yeah, there it is. I wasn't sure how to do that. I've seen Francis Fukuyama and Noam Chomsky and many, many others. And I can tell you, sometimes 60 people turn up and some pretty interesting names amidst his audience as well. So I strongly recommend you guys, everybody, take a subscription. Peter teaches national reporting and opinion writing at the Newark Journalism School and political science at Cooney Graduate Center. He is a graduate of Yale University and a Rhodes Scholar. I'm going to skip through the very long list of introductions because I want to get straight to it, but I will give a plug for the Icarus Syndrome, one of his books. In fact, not a million miles from what we're going to talk about this evening. And Peter, somebody asked me how I knew Peter. Well, I follow him on many of his articles. He publishes extensively in the New York Times and some always very interesting, often controversial, but certainly thought-provoking op-ed pieces. This evening, he's going to talk to us about the Biden foreign policy. We read John Eikenberry's version of that last week, but Peter's going to talk for a few minutes and then we'll do Q&A. So go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you, and it's great to be with you, Paul. I thank you for those kind words. I'll say a few things, and then we enjoy having a conversation and hearing from you. I agree with John Eikenberry that at the center of Joe Biden's foreign policy is the notion of what you could call a strategic competition with China. But I think that casting it as a strategic competition in some ways misses the point, because a competition is a method. It doesn't suggest the outcome that you want, right? The goal, the Biden administration, is not competition for competition's sake. I think the goal is preserving American hegemony, preventing China from toppling America's current position as the kind of clear as the kind of country that that is most powerful in the world and kind of sets the rules for global engagement around the world, including in East Asia, even in China's own backyard. I think that it may already appear, and it may appear to future historians as if this was inevitable, that the Biden administration would essentially make the defense of American hegemony against China, and now what I think it tends to describe as kind of China as the senior partner and Russia as the junior partner, and a kind of a dual threat to American hegemony. This may seem obvious or overdetermined, but I think it's worth remembering that there was not a demand from the people who elected Joe Biden to make this the center of his foreign policy. This was actually really an adaptation and a continuation of Trump's foreign policy. I mean, it was Trump, or at least the people around Trump, who wrote the strategic documents that said the war on terror is over. Our new focus is great power competition with Russia and China. Now, Trump himself was obviously a bit ambivalent about the Russia part, but his own strategist wrote this as America's new post-war on terror doctrine, and Biden has adopted it. What he's really done is added the notion that it'll be done with allies. He said Trump's big problem was that this was done in a kind of unilateral way. We're going to harness America's strength in this great power competition, this effort to maintain American hegemony, by rallying our allies, because the only way we remain much stronger than China is, among other things, by leveraging the kind of combined weight of America with its allies and partners in Europe and in East Asia. But this was not something that was being called for by most Democrats. In fact, if you look at the foreign policy issue that concerns most Democrats the most, it's climate change. And I might add, for quite good reason. And I think that was that was during the campaign. But I think if you asked Americans what other global threats they worry about, many of them would say the threat of pandemics. And it's those a vision. I would argue, if you put climate change and global public health at the center of your foreign policy, you would actually have ended up in a quite different place in terms of how you approached America's relationship with China. You would have thought that actually the great threats that China poses to the United States stem less from its potential eclipsing or diminishing of American hegemony, and more from an insufficient American-Chinese cooperation, since it's only through American-Chinese cooperation is crucial to protecting against the next pandemic, and also crucial to kind of to working on climate change for a number of reasons, including among the fact that actually I think it's the combination of US and Chinese strengths that would actually allow for the acceleration of green technologies at affordable prices to spread throughout the world. That's the path that the Biden administration has not taken. And so I think we need to, rather than just assuming this was inevitable, ask questions about why it has not taken this path. And I think that there are several reasons, one of which has to do with the kind of institutional weight and direction of the kind of democratic foreign policy class. America is in a moment of hyperpolarization, but the American foreign policy establishment actually is fairly bipartisan. So you see, for instance, and that bipartisanship is forged around in Washington institutions that are generally committed to the notion of American hegemony, and generally quite likely to see American problems in terms of military threats. Now, this is partly because a lot of the think tanks that produce people in both Democratic administrations get a significant amount of money from defense contractors. Probably no think tank has produced more high-level members of the Biden foreign policy team than the Center for New American Security, which is the think tank in Washington which gets the most money from defense contractors of any others. They have produced Kurt Campbell, who has the title of "quote unquote" Asia Czar, running Asia policy at the National Security Council, immensely influential person on China policy. And then also Eli Ratner, who is in charge of China policy at the Pentagon, for instance, just to give two examples. But it doesn't only happen through think tanks. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, was on the board of Raytheon. Tony Blinken was a consultant for a consulting firm that among other things, consulted with defense contractors. So this is considered in some ways slightly impolite to talk about, I find, in kind of foreign policy commentary. It's weird. In domestic commentary, it seems much more conventional to say, well, if the person of the Biden administration comes from Goldman Sachs, then that has an impact on how they think. And in fact, the left of the Democratic Party, people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, have pushed quite hard to reorient the Democratic Party's economic policy away from people like, let's say, Robert Rubin, who was Clinton's most influential economic advisor, and other like, people who came from Wall Street. And I think there has been a significant change in foreign policy, which remains a much more elite-driven discourse. There's much less focus on that, and much less, and the costs of appointing people like that are very low. But I think it's, again, if you want to understand, one way of understanding why the Biden administration, I think, prioritizes the maintenance of American global hegemony vis-a-vis China far over questions like climate change. And you can see this just, for instance, in the big China speech that Tony Blinken gave several weeks ago, where I think the subject of climate really didn't come up until the 38th minute of the speech. One way of trying to understand that is you might just look, for instance, at the Center for New American Security's own website and look for its discussion of climate change versus its discussion of essentially what it considers kind of military security issues, especially in East Asia. And you'll find that one dramatically dwarfs the other. And these are the kind of people who have very senior policies in Biden's administration. And I think they are also able to do that because the American left, again, epitomized by people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and AOC and others, is much more influential and vocal on domestic policy questions than on foreign policy questions. So one, I think, important indices of this is, if you remember, Bernie Sanders ended up being Biden's strongest competitor in 2020. And the Biden folks were clearly worried about a drawn out antagonistic fight all the way to the convention, which is something that they believe maybe had hurt Hillary Clinton. And so one of the ways they got Bernie Sanders to drop out was to create these joint task forces to develop policy on a range of different subjects. Now, of those 6, there was none that specifically focused on foreign policy. There was one on climate, but there was none that actually really dealt in an overall way with America's policy towards the world. And you can see that while there's no significant Bernie Sanders advisor who has a prominent role in the Biden administration on foreign policy. So while you can see that the way that Biden and Elizabeth Warren, especially in the post-George Floyd moment and the post-Occupy moment, have affected the Biden administration's thinking on questions like budget deficits, regulation, spending, criminal justice, these kinds of issues, they've had much less impact on foreign policy. And foreign policy is an area where the Biden administration is able to operate with much less influence, I would say, from the base of the Democratic Party. And it's the base of the Democratic Party which I think would be generally fairly unhappy with what you could call what I would call a kind of neo-Cold War posture that Biden has adopted. It's also worth noting that this, I think Eikenberry mentioned in this essay, this narrative that engagement with China failed, which was something that was pushed by Kurt Campbell in an influential essay that he co-wrote, has become taken as kind of gospel. I don't actually think it's empirically convincing at all, actually. I think it's convincing if you create this straw man idea that engagement was supposed to make China a liberal democracy. But if what engagement was supposed to do was to actually get China to be a country that was more economically open to the United States and the rest of the world, I think it serially succeeded. It made China actually, I think, a much less radical force in international relations, because than China had certainly been under Mao. And I think actually China's level of kind of playing by the rules economically quite significantly increased during the period of American engagement. Even as it's true that there was some kind of regression in terms of China becoming more authoritarian and more dictatorial again. I think that one of the anyway, just to go back to my bipartisan point, you can see the kind of the way the foreign policy establishment works in Washington, in the sense that you have people like Victoria Nuland, who's the #3 person at the State Department, who worked for Democrats like Strobe Powell, but also worked for Dick Cheney as his national security advisor. So you actually have you arguably, I think, have more people in the Biden administration in top foreign policy positions who have close ties to Republicans like Cheney and McCain than you do to people who have close ties to someone like Bernie Sanders. The other I think it also has to do with I think this is also a product of Biden himself. I think that although I think Biden wouldn't say it in these terms, I think there is a way in which Biden kind of romanticizes the Cold War, sees it as a period of American purpose and American strength and success. And that's, I think, in significant measure because Biden, and this is true for much of the foreign policy establishment, is really an Atlanticist who tends to see the world through the prism of the North Atlantic and America's relationship with Europe. So if your vision of the Cold War is fundamentally focused on Europe and the fact that the US held the line against Soviet encroachment into Central and Western Europe, and then ultimately that there was a kind of democracy movement that led to the extension of American power and the extension of democracy into Eastern Europe, the Cold War looks like a pretty rosy story. I don't think that's how Barack Obama saw the Cold War. I think Barack Obama, again, if you can read his book, The Audacity of Hope, where he talks about what the Cold War meant in Indonesia, a place where he grew up, right? As Obama as someone who had much more experience than Biden did in the developing world and could see things, I think, much more easily through the eyes of the developing world. I think you have a different picture of what the Cold War looks like. The Cold War is a much, much more grim story and much less morally uplifting and much less clear who's wearing the black hats and the white hats when one looks at in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And I think Biden, unlike Obama, didn't have that prism. And so I think that he is less conscious than Obama would have been of the consequences of what this global competition, this militarized effort to maintain American hegemony, rather than looking for ways of reaching kind of new forms of cooperation and kind of rapprochement with China. I think that Biden would have been more, I think that Obama would have been more aware of the consequences of what this may look like in developing countries. And I think we're just at the very, very beginning of seeing how that story plays itself out. It's interesting, even if you look at very small countries, for instance, in the South Pacific, which don't tend to get a lot of attention in the United States, in the American press, you can clearly see the way in which an increasingly ferocious competition between the United States with its local allies, Australia in particular, and China, is leading to increasing instability in these countries. And I think moving us closer to the situation where we're going to have coups, just like we did in the Cold War in places like Chile and Guatemala and other places, which will be justified by the fear that we're going to be losing these countries to China. And if you look, Jake Sullivan did an interesting interview about a couple of weeks ago. By the way, the interview was at the Center for a New American Security. That's the place that he went to do this interview. He was interviewed by the head of the Center for New American Security, who was a former aide to John McCain. And he was asked about Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, right? Biden talks a lot about, America as a force for democracy and revitalizing American democracy against our authoritarian competitors. Of course, that was a big, that language was very prominent in the Cold War too. But what you saw in the Cold War was that essentially the definition of who was on the side of democracy, who was on the side of the free world, became anyone who was anti-communist or anti-Soviet, right? So all manner of brutal, deeply repressive regimes, from apartheid South Africa to Mobutu in Congo, to Pinochet, to many others, were basically seen as on the side of the angels, because and what was striking to me about Sullivan's interview was the way he reprised that. He basically said, they said, well, what, you're supposed to be making this big thing of democracy. You're going to meet with now Mohammed bin Salman. And parenthetically, it's important when one thinks about this trip to Saudi Arabia, it's not just that the Saudis and also the Emiratis are repressive domestically. It's not just that Mohammed bin Salman, butchered on a journalist who in the United States, who lived in the United States, Jamal Khashoggi, but these governments, these repressive governments, have been the most powerful forces against democracy and in favor of tyranny across the Middle East. If you want, from the coup in Egypt to the recent coup in Saudi Arabia to the coup in Sudan, they all have the fingerprints of the Saudis and the Emiratis. So these are not just repressive regimes. These are regimes that play a crucial role in ensuring repression across their entire region because of their money. And what Sullivan said was essentially, what the most important measure, he said, of a country in this new global environment is how it responds to the big authoritarian threats, by which he meant, what is your position on Russia and China? But as if to say, if you yourself are repressive and you're fostering repression in your own region, that is less important in how we judge you than whether you're on our side in the global struggle against authoritarianism, which is a struggle against China and Russia. And then there's a certain doublespeak in that, right? Because once Saudi Arabia is part of the coalition, how much is it a coalition against authoritarianism anyway? Right. But that's very reminiscent of the kind of the language that existed during the Cold War. I will, the other point I think that Eikenberry makes is that America's ability to win this global struggle against against China and Russia will depend on the strength of the American model at home, whether we can save and reinvigorate our democracy and show that we can have broad-based economic prosperity. I would just say that, that's not looking very good this week. It's looking very grim. I think that Biden's right that that's a crucial element. I think that the American ability to pass civil rights legislation in the 1960s and become something closer to a genuine multiracial democracy, I think was very important in America's victory in the Cold War. But I think it's sobering to think that now that if in the heart of the Cold War, the United States moved towards multiracial democracy, at the beginning of this new global struggle, as defined by the Biden administration, we're moving away from multiracial democracy. Maybe we will find some way of coming back to, of shifting that dynamic. But it seems to me for the foreseeable future, the United States is moving back closer towards becoming essentially a white Christian male authoritarian dominated political system. So I'll stop there.
Wow, tremendous. Thank you, Peter. That was really tour de force. That's a lecture from a top Yale or Harvard professor or CUNY professor on the recent developments. I've got a couple of questions just to get things going, but everybody online, please post, either raise your hand or put something in the chat, indicate to Chris that you'd like to ask the question either in writing, but we'd actually prefer if you would ask it in person. It saves writing and saves rereading. Peter, I was very struck by a couple of things you said. The idea of the idea that foreign policy is bipartisan, whereas clearly domestic policy is not. And you, of course, as usual, very perceptively hit the nail on the head. It's only an appearance of bipartisan because it's just, bipartisan between the very far right and the slightly right of center. And so effectively, if the elements within the Biden foreign policy establishment are to the right, slightly to the right of center, then, they get on very well on certain subjects. Whereas people who are on the further to the left of the Democratic Party, who would prefer we talk about things like perhaps climate change or world justice or whatever, they're sideswiped, and it just appears to be bipartisan, so whoopee. And this brings me to the idea we had a few years ago. We had Stephen Walt visit us and talking about the blob and the whole idea that there's this group in DC area and New York probably who run the sort of foreign policy establishment, and I'm interested to hear you describe it as an elite foreign policy is an elite driven more than domestic. So is there a way to break that? Because clearly Walt can say what he can, and I'm trying to think who was the other person. It was on your Friday morning, John Mearsheimer, who commented he could say things like part of the problem of the war in Ukraine was NATO expansion, but he can say it because he's a professor. He's not going to lose his job. He's not going to. He's an established figure. But how to get that kind of voice in the foreign policy establishment? Now, yeah, maybe we need a different. Maybe the Democrats are never going to do that. But is there a way to do that? How do we do that and make it real?
I mean, I think the truth is that American foreign policy has, except during periods of war when the American people have really become mobilized, American foreign policy has more often than not been an elite-driven enterprise. These are issues that feel more remote to ordinary people's lives and seem to require some kind of specialized knowledge. Again, there are exceptions outside of war. I think you can look at, for instance, the impact of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States in the 1980s, which did shift American foreign policy. So there have been the movement to stop American complicity in the war against Yemen had some, I think, success in tempering a little bit America's involvement there. So one can find examples, but by and large, I think this tends to be the norm. The Democratic. There are folks on the right in a different way who also have a kind of critique of the blob, right? It's a different critique because they're not necessarily concerned about climate change, but there is what you could say called a non-interventionist, or even if you wanted to call it isolationist impulse that exists on the right. You can see it with someone like Tucker Carlson. I think you see it more clearly vis-a-vis Russia than you see it with China, because I think with Russia, there's also a sense of an unspoken or sometimes spoken kind of racial civilizational identification with Russia, that they shouldn't be our enemies, where I think with China, I suspect that Carlson will end up being more hawkish on China because even though he's generally interventionist, I think he will fold China into his general notion of kind of racial threat. But on the left, I think that the prominent figures on the left have not been very effective in kind of building a Democratic Party counter-establishment on foreign policy. That you see there is this new think tank, relatively new think tank called the Quincy Institute, which exists, which I think tries to make some of those arguments, which is interestingly funded by both George Soros on the left and the Koch brothers, who are kind of, you could say, kind of non-interventionist conservatives. But I think there are a number of reasons that this doesn't happen. Again, first of all, one of the points that Walt makes, I think, which is, I think, convincing to me, is that there's a kind of inherent interest in the people who make American foreign policy for America to be very, very interventionist, kind of involved in things all over the world, because in some ways it gives them more to do. It's kind of, it creates a kind of more of a drama and importance of their work. I think there's some of that. Again, I think there's also material explanations here, which is that a lot of, think tanks are not, universities are not pure either, but think tanks are less pure than universities. People don't have tenure. People have to basically get funding for their research. And a lot of funding does come from the defense industry. Also sometimes comes from foreign governments that have a particular interest in America being engaged in their part of the world, whether those are governments in East Asia, like Japan or South Korea, for instance, or a non-government like Taiwan, or governments in the Gulf, for instance, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris. So I think that those are, and that, you know, also, I think those are part of the story. I also think that I think it's important that the makers of American foreign policy, particularly in the Democratic Party, are significantly less racially diverse than the people who make American domestic policy. And you see that not only among foreign policy, you see very much among commentators. If you look, I mean, if you just, you know, turn on cable TV and hear a conversation about domestic issues, and then watch the conversation as it turns to, let's say, Russia, Ukraine, you will notice that the cast of characters will look different. And that's true on op-ed pages too. If you look at who are the columnists who focus on domestic affairs and who are the columnists who focus on foreign affairs, I think there remains strong barriers and to, in a sense that, well, people of color in the United States, maybe they can give their opinion about things that maybe affect their communities domestically, but the foreign policy is something that is kind of still remains, I think, often led by people whose set of experiences are very different. And again, I think this really matters in the same way it mattered in the same way that Biden's experience is different than Obama's experience. You could say that kind of unspoken and assumed logic of American foreign policy is the idea of American exceptionalism, that America is a force for good around the world. Therefore, that maintaining American hegemony is crucial, not just to our own interests, but to the good of the world, to the good of humanity. And that is simply an easier thing to accept as a given if your experience as an American has not involved, you know, profound structural oppression yourself. It's not surprising that many of the people who've made kind of radical critiques of American foreign policy have often come out of people who are making radical critiques of America's systems of government at home. And those people disproportionately tend to often be people of color, and they are quite underrepresented in the foreign policy debate.
We do have a question in the chat from Aaron Rosenberg, and I know Michael has his hand raised.
Yes.
So I'll read you Aaron's question, and then we can switch over to Michael after that. Would you please comment on Biden's policy regarding peace between the Israelis and Palestinians?
I think Biden's primary concern is not peace between Israelis and Palestinians, it's peace between himself and the Israeli government, which is that his primary goal is to avoid conflict with the Israeli government, because I think he feels that that would be politically costly to him and a politically costly distraction from the things he wants to focus on. So in order to do that, I think he's basically decided that he's really not going to do anything the Israeli government doesn't want him to do. And again, I think this is his interpretation of the fact that Obama had some kind of bruising fights with Netanyahu in the first 2 years of his administration. And even in that Obama administration, I wrote about this and I've done some reporting on it. Biden did not want Obama to pick those fights, which Obama did. Again, I think also partly their own difference of perspective and life experience. And Biden has made a very clear point of not. So I'm not even talking about things as grand as, you know, imposing costs on Israel for settlement growth or pushing Israel to support a Palestinian state near the 67 lines, which the current Israeli government does not, but even just much, much more modest stuff, just reversing some of the things that Trump did that no one had done before him. Like Trump closed the PLO office in Washington, D.C. Trump closed the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem that had serviced Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Biden has not been willing to reverse even those decisions, right? You know, those were Trump decisions that Biden has not been willing to do. And Biden has also not really, I think, been willing to make a truly bold effort at reviving the Iran nuclear deal. He didn't do it right at the beginning of his administration when I think he could have before the election of a more hardline Iranian government. And now we see that from the reporting, the issue that's holding things up above all is the lifting of the designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Now that's basically a symbolic issue because the U.S. has lots of sanctions, other sanctions on the IRGC that would be sanctioned anyway. It's really mostly just that it gives the Republicans a political argument to say you're lifting this terrorist designation over this organization. And if Biden were willing to do that, I think it's quite likely he could revive the Iran nuclear deal. But there would be a fight, domestic fight, and that domestic fight would be very much influenced by the fact that American members of Congress would be in alliance with the Israeli government in their opposition. And Biden doesn't want that fight. And so as a result, I think his willingness to, again, you know, this is the kind of thing that part of the American discourse kind of suggests that somehow an American president can say that democracy and freedom are the kind of lodestars, the North Star, the guiding principle of foreign policy, but then simply make these exceptions. You know, yes, except for the Palestinians, you know, who for more than 50 years lacked the most basic rights, living in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza under Israeli control, without even citizenship in the country that dominates their lives. And you just say, well, that's we don't count that. Okay, you can say we don't count that. But then don't be surprised when some developing country that needs a lot of Russian grain says, well, yeah, we're making an exception for Russia, Ukraine, in terms of our belief in international law and democracy, right? Well, if why is that any more hypocritical than what America's doing, right? So, but again, this is, I think, kind of baked into the way Americans, a lot of American foreign policies just kind of assume, but people in the rest of the world notice this, and it tends to make them pretty cynical.
Great. Michael, go ahead.
Yep. Beinart,
You're breaking up, Michael.
I apologize. You think it's inevitable that America will be in competition?
No,
no,
I'm not getting you.
Type it in the chat.
We got something about it. Is it
putting it in the chat.
inevitable?
He's going to type it into the chat.
Type it in. Okay, go ahead. So while Michael's typing, let me remind me, Peter, who the head of the Center for New American Century is?
New American Security. I
think you mentioned that this person interviewed Jake Sullivan. I knew this.
Yeah, his name is Richard Fontaine.
Oh.
He was a McCain staffer. Yeah, you can find it.
I'm thinking of a different organization. I'm thinking
yeah.
of
The interview with Jake Sullivan is worth watching. I mean, Jake Sullivan is a very smart guy, and I think it's interesting to hear the way he articulates this vision.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation that we say to other countries. We're only interested in what your thoughts are on China and Russia, not on some local despot or local regional bully. You can sort that out yourself, and of course sometimes the regional bully is more important. Anyway, here's Michael's question. You can see it yourself there. Is it inevitable that America and China engage in competition, strategic or otherwise? Is it possible to engage in economic competition but cooperation on climate and world health?
Yes, and I appreciate the question. I think actually the terminology is important. The US and China are going to compete. I think actually competition undersells what the US policy is. I think the US policy is to treat China as an adversary, and to see US-China relations very often in kind of zero-sum terms. So for instance, if China is providing aid or investment to countries in the global South through the Belt and Road Initiative, that's something the United States needs to oppose and try to counter, convince them not to take this, create some kind of alternative. Well, why should that necessarily be America's posture? I mean, maybe what the United States should be doing is actually working with China to actually trying to giving these countries, because America has certain expertise that China may not have, to work with China to actually give countries the kind of investment that especially green investment that they need, because one of the crucial challenges facing the world is, can these countries produce economic growth and go through a kind of transition, economic transition that we've seen in the global north without, destroying the planet in the process, right? This is something that the U.S. and China could be working on together. But instead, it becomes, well, what's our alternative? How are we going to convince China that countries to not be in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, by the way, we're not succeeding very much in that, and how are we going to basically lure them out of it? So I think that I think it's the zero-sum nature of the way in which the Biden administration treats China that bothers me a lot. The two countries are going to inevitably compete to some degree, but I would rather than having kind of it seems to me that if one starts with a question of American national interest, and particularly the interests of ordinary Americans, what do Americans need from China in order to be able to be safe from the things that are most likely to threaten them, then one might move the question of Chinese influence over islands in the South China Sea down the list a little bit. Not to say it doesn't matter at all, but to say that it's not actually something that's likely to threaten the life of an American, and move questions of climate and pandemics up the list. And I think that's something that, even though the Biden administration has talked a lot about kind of foreign policy of the middle class, I don't think it's internalized that on these issues. And I also don't think it is internalized the way in which a Cold War posture towards China and Russia, what consequences that will have for American domestic, for Americans at home in terms of what it does to the US government. There is a way in which I don't think it's coincidence. America is right now in the midst of this, I think, this kind of white Christian male, very ferocious backlash against the kind of modest progress towards greater equality that we'd seen since the 1960s. When you add in a Cold War, especially a Cold War against a non-white, non-Christian adversary, I think you start to unleash things inside the American body politic, that are going to be dangerous. And the Biden administration, people may not, it's not like Trump, who was perfectly happy to openly fan this racist stuff. But I think the Biden administration people don't sufficiently think about what this is going to unleash. We're already seeing, and I think not coincidentally, a big rise, a very frightening rise in anti-Asian violence. We saw with the China Threat Initiative of the Justice Department, really McCarthyite kind of move that really destroyed the careers of a lot of Chinese and Chinese American researchers, almost all of whom were not even accused of spying, but they were just accused of having relationships with Chinese institutions that they had been encouraged to develop during the period of engagement, and then they didn't adequately disclose everything involved in those relationships. And so I worry that is just the kind of tip of the iceberg, and that things that are going to be unleashed will be things that will really harm America and will empower a national security state that is just not always benign, especially towards people that it identifies with America's adversaries, who tend to be people who share the race, religion, ethnicity of America's adversaries. America's history in that regard, whether you go back to what happened to German Americans during World War I, which was just horrific. I mean, it's one of the reasons so few Americans have German last names, is because the oppression during World War was so brutal. People changed their last names. I mean, they literally outlawed the playing of Bach and Beethoven in parts of the United States. And of course, Japanese Americans during World War II. So I think this is something another thing that I really worry about.
Yeah, no, I was going to comment that the ghost of Senator McCarthy is hovering off stage just about.
Yes.
It's kind of scary.
Yes.
So one thing that I've heard argued on this to do with this relationship with China, because on the face of it, it looks like China did what we wanted them to do.
Right.
Throw off the yoke of communism, which effectively they've done. Except now it's state-run capitalism. Okay, well, it's at least a step towards capitalism, and capitalism is the first or second great religion in America. Mm-hmm. But it seems like that they've sort of outdone themselves, or there's a concern and people argue, I've heard it argued that this is to do with President Xi, and that actually if there was a different Chinese leader leading this, we'd be less concerned, because Xi is, and he has all this weird stuff we hear about, where I saw something in the Financial Times that, if you've got a degree in Marxism from a Chinese university, you have a better chance of getting a job in China. Not that a degree in Marxism is going to teach you anything about the world, but that's what you need to get. It's kind of like you go to church on a Sunday or Saturday or whatever in some countries. So what do you think about the argument that, we kind of got what we wanted, but it kind of went a little astray, and now we're actually justified in having this competition and in saying that China is not a good place, because they went off the rails more than, they didn't just embrace Western capitalism. They're now trying to outdo Western capitalism,
Right. I mean, I do think it's true that China, after going through a period of some political liberalization, has moved sharply back in the other direction under this Chinese leadership, and has done some in some really horrifying ways. But first of all, I don't really buy the idea that that's the driving force of this reorientation of U.S. foreign policy. I think it has really much more to do with China as a seen as a potential threat to America's position in East Asia in particular, than it has to do with what's happening in China domestically. I mean, India is not as repressive as China, but India is moving politically in a very frightening fascist direction. And that has not inhibited the continued growth of US-Indian closer and closer relationships, right? I mean, Narendra Modi was once banned from even entering the United States because of the massive riot that he encouraged when he was the governor of Gujarat in Ayodhya, which was an early sign of his kind of anti-Muslim ethnic chauvinism, trying to turn India from a secular state into a Hindu national state, which will be one of the great calamities for liberalism of our age. When you think about how important a country India is, essentially, I mean, India is really taking Israel as its model in many ways. I think that the problem of looking at what China is doing in isolation is that there's a feedback loop between how the U.S. and China behave, right? And so if you look at where American-China relations were when Donald Trump was elected, right? And then you think about how dramatically they deteriorated between January of 2017 and January of 2020. The key, more of those moves were made by the U.S. than China. I mean, I think that it's not that China wasn't doing anything; it was increasing its power, in East Asia. But if you think about the tariffs, for instance, right, the side in this relationship that basically decided to impose massive tariffs and try to essentially kind of extinguish the Chinese industries that the Chinese were trying to invest in. That was the United States. That was the Trump administration which did that. So I think the United States did more between 2017 and 2021 to turn to move the relationship in a dramatically negative direction than the Chinese did. Now the Chinese reacted, and it's produced this extremely negative feedback loop now, which has had an impact not just on Chinese elites, but on Chinese public opinion as well. But I think that it's dangerous to look at Chinese behavior in isolation without also thinking about the way in which the United States has also contributed to this again, China is a country that has a strong history of a kind of strong memory of Western imperialism. This looms very, very large in the kind of Chinese political memory, that China was powerful, it was destroyed by Japan and these Western powers, and now China is going to rise again. And the Trump administration, and I think to the Biden administration has really done a really great job of fueling exactly that narrative, which is essentially the narrative that the U.S. And its allies want to basically keep China down, if not ultimately, break China apart. And I think that has encouraged the kind of worst tendencies inside Chinese politics.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
There's another one in the chat.
Oh, good. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, so from Michael again. What is your prediction for Taiwan remaining an independent state over the next 5 years? How would you recommend the US respond to China on this issue?
Well, I think that I don't know whether the current situation, which is that you have peace in the south, in the Taiwan Straits, and China and Taiwan functioning as an effectively as an independent country, and a very impressive and admirable one at that. Whether that is sustainable over the long term, but I think that it's desperately in our interest to try to sustain it, because the consequences of it breaking down are of world historical significance, and it would be a cataclysm. And so I think that one way to do that is to maintain the one China policy that the U.S. has had, which has served the United States, I think, and the people of Taiwan very, very well, which there's been a lot of pressure to move away from, which meant that the U.S. kept its relationship with Taiwan non-official, which Trump began to move away from, and Biden has also to some degree moved away from. I also think that that you can't separate the Taiwan part from the overall element, the overall dynamic in the relationship, which is to say, if we want to avoid a situation where we're faced with the horrific and a decision of what we do in response to a Chinese invasion, it's important to think about the overall nature of the U.S. relationship, right? So, and Biden has not lifted Trump's tariffs, right? I mean, that every Democratic economist, Biden's own economist, said these were economically illiterate, that they were not. They were basically just forcing Americans to charge more for the products we got. They weren't having a negative effect on China. They were having a much more negative effect on the American consumer than they were having on China. They were a product of Trump's complete economic illiteracy, where he literally thought that tariffs are great because the other countries pay them, right? I mean, and yet Biden hasn't lifted them because he's, I think he's afraid of the politics of that, or he wants to use them as leverage. And so this is also part of the overall U.S. relationship, right? And makes China feels like the U.S. is trying to strangle it economically, and that has negative repercussions for the issue of Taiwan. I think it's lunacy and very dangerous for Biden to go out there and say the U.S. is going to fight, is going to go to war for Taiwan. That's essentially World War III. Biden does not have the authority to pledge that the United States will fight World War III. If he wants to do that, he should go to Congress and get an authorization, some kind of authorization. The American people are not overwhelmingly supportive of this. And I think that once told what the consequences of such a war would be, this is not going to be Iraq or Afghanistan. It's going to be tens and tens of thousands of US casualties, the sinking of much of the American Pacific Fleet, even assuming it didn't go nuclear. And some of the people who know China best in the United States, J. Stapleton Roy, the former ambassador, Chas Freeman, who was Nixon's interpreter when he went to China, have both said that such a conflict over Taiwan could go nuclear. It is, to me, insanity and and just says something about the elitism and the kind of lack of democratic impulses of America's foreign policy establishment, that you have prominent people like the head of this Council on Foreign Relations, who were urging Biden to just unilaterally say that we would go to war for Taiwan. And now Biden himself saying that 3 times. In a democracy, this is not the way decisions like that are supposed to be made. It's not the way our Constitution is set up. So anyway, this is some thoughts about Taiwan.
Yeah, no, good. Thank you. Another question, and we'll probably leave this as the last one or the second last, from Janet Amon. Can you speak a little more about the white male Christian dominance that you alluded to before, and what would be the consequences of it, etc., possibly in the context of foreign policy, but maybe domestic as well?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to put I'm going to just put a link in the chat to an essay that I had an influence on me in my thinking about this. It's co-authored by a guy named Kaiser Kuo, who's writing about China, who's thinking about China, I really like a lot. He has a terrific podcast that I enjoy called the Sinica Podcast, and he,
Great.
you know,
Thank you.
which is focused on China. I think that the anxieties about China that have emerged, you're seeing in the 2022 campaign, for instance, how many campaigns are running on the idea that, you know, of the threat of China, kind of implying, and again, in very McCarthyite terms, that their opponents are basically somehow bought by China. I don't think one can separate this from the dynamic that has played such a profound role in American domestic politics in the Trump era, which is essentially a politics based on fears that that kind of the relatively unchallenged dominance of white Christian American men is now under threat, and that there needs to be a kind of a ferocious effort to kind of restore that. And I think when you think about the threat of a non-white, non-Christian power after a period of more than centuries, really, in which the center of global power has been Europe, or then Europe and the United States. This is not just a massive geopolitical shift. It's a massive, I would say, it's a shift that will be internalized by many Americans in civilizational, and I would even say racial and religious terms. And I think that's something that worries me a lot, partly because I think, and I would recommend Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence. If you read his section on what he calls the Jacksonian tradition, one of the points that he makes, and that others have made too, is that when America fights against what it is historically considered uncivilized adversaries, by which it's basically meant non-white, non-Christian adversaries, America has tended to be much more ferocious in its response because of this racial element. And so this gives me a lot of reason to worry about how America deals with a rising China and a comparatively declining United States in the same moment that it deals with this perception and fear of a kind of declining in relative power, kind of white Christian male kind of population inside the United States. So I think that, unfortunately, because foreign policy and domestic policy are often talked about as separate issues, that these connections are not thought about as much as they should be. But Kaiser and his co-author do a good job of talking about it in this piece.
Great, Peter. Thank you. No, that's actually is one of the things I'm taking from this, is that I need to pay more attention to the dynamic between domestic and foreign. I'm marginally interested in domestic, except when the Congress building is being attacked by my fellow citizens. But I'm mostly interested in foreign affairs, but I need to see how they're connected. Thank you very much for coming to see us this evening. As always, fascinating, stimulating. People, get out there and subscribe to Peter's Friday event. It's really wonderful. Chris, do you want to finish up with a few words? You're on mute.
Sure. Yep. Yes. Thanks very much. It was a very interesting presentation, Peter, and I appreciate your time in answering all of the questions. And I did capture the links. So when I send out a link to the recording, I'll also share the two links that Peter shared in the chat. So thank you again. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.